Hello, listener. This is The Way In, a podcast about finding our way through the often impenetrable worlds of psychotherapy, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. I'm your host, Tyson Connor. I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist and clinical supervisor in Washington State. Each episode of this show, I talk with other mental health professionals about the work they do and topics they care about, using language that you don't need an advanced degree to understand. Come join us as we try to find the way in. And today, our guide is Shierry Weber Nicholsen. Shierry is a psychoanalyst in private practice in Seattle. She's the author of 2 books, Exact Imagination, Late Work on Adorno's Aesthetics, and The Love of Nature and the End of the World, The Unspoken Dimensions of Environmental Concern. She's also the translator of several works by Adorno and his colleagues, most recently Walter Benjamin's Berlin Childhood, circa 1900. Shierry, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And today you are going to be our guide into the topic of moral injury. I often start by asking folks, with the idea that all theory is autobiography, what brought them to the topic. But I feel like moral injury is so little understood. Maybe we should start just with a definition.
Okay.
So what is moral injury? What are we even talking about today?
Moral injury is basically an assault on a person's deepest moral convictions, like something that goes against their conscience. And it can be something that somebody else does that's just deeply appalling, or it can be something you do yourself, which you cringe remembering that you've done, or it can be some of these things that you witness as a witness.
So in the broadest terms, moral injury is the impact of being somehow involved in something that violates your deepest values.
Right. That's right. Moral injury came to be something that we've heard of and start talking about these days through this one psychiatrist, Jonathan Shay's work with traumatized Vietnam veterans who felt later, he was working with them in the 90s, that they had just done things that had turned them into an evil person, or that they had been so betrayed by the military in one way or the other. And here they are, inpatients or traumatized outpatients, deep injuries. And Shay's definition of moral injury is betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority or oneself in high-stakes situations.
Betrayal of what's right in high-stakes situations by someone in authority or oneself.
Right. And then it gets elaborated by a psychoanalyst, Mildred Antonelli, who says, well, it's not necessarily the army or officials. As a person growing up, you have legitimate expectations of your caregivers and teachers and so forth and so on. And if they betray your legitimate expectations, can have the same kind of effect.
Gotcha. Kind of like how a lot of theorizing around trauma and the impacts of trauma came out of, shell shock and soldiers coming back from war with this intense specific trauma.
That's right.
Sort of gave us a way into thinking about trauma as therapists.
That's right.
It sounds like Jonathan Shay has this concept in a very extreme context. The extremity of it makes it easier to approach, I suppose.
Yeah.
And then Mildred Antonelli starts saying like, well, actually, these are some ideas or these are some experiences that people can have in less obvious or less undeniable, less clear ways. This is a part of becoming a person, is having these experiences.
That's right. And then people in healthcare started talking about moral injury because if you're a healthcare person, you've taken an oath, a Hippocratic oath to help your patient. And they say that the current kind of for-profit way that healthcare is becoming more and more organized makes it impossible to do that. So they feel they're betraying their oath.
Right.
And it's an identifiable issue by healthcare people.
Yeah, I had this conversation with a friend of mine and his partner,
Mm.
and she's a nurse. I'm a psychotherapist, so we
Yeah.
have some overlap in the healthcare world.
Yeah.
And we were talking about some of the gosh, it's hard to work within these systems, to work with insurance companies and the rules and the laws and what you are allowed to do and what you're not.
Yeah.
And feeling the limitations and sometimes even knowing that the thing you're doing is not what's best for the patient, but it's what you have to do because that's the system you're in.
Uh-huh.
I really experienced that as a provider when I did crisis stabilization work with kids and did hospital evaluations and things like that.
Uh-huh.
There were so many times where I knew what my job was and it was very different than what I thought would be best for the families.
Wow.
But you're limited. And then my friend who's what is he? He's an engineer. He designs stuff.
Uh-huh.
But at the time he was working for a company that was subcontracted with Amazon. And he said, yeah, I'm working on a machine. I won't go into the specifics of the machine because I don't understand it and I don't want to break his NDA.
Yeah.
But he said, I'm working on a machine that's going to make it easier for Amazon to exploit workers. And that's my daily job. And all three of us were just
Ed.
oh.
Right.
So is that moral injury, that feeling we were having?
Well, that's what I would say. Yeah.
So let's go back to the biography question. With this idea, all theory is autobiography on some level. What drew you initially to this idea? What brought you into it?
So where it crystallized for me, I must have read Shay's book without paying enough attention. And then I was in an organizational context where the leadership did some really appalling things. And I realized in my own reaction, my own emotional reaction to what they had, to the situation, and talking with some other colleagues who were impacted, I saw this kind of constellation of emotions that now I identify as moral injury. And then all of a sudden I said, oh, this is moral injury. And then I could go back to Shay and see, oh, yes, he's been writing about this. And then, of course, we've all probably experienced moral injury to different degrees many times.
Sure.
So then I thought, oh, this is what I was feeling like during the Vietnam War and so forth. So in my book, I talk about killing in combat, and I talk about the nuclear situation, and I talk about racism. And the need for reparations for racism is another place where professionals have started talking explicitly about moral injury, making the case. This is a pair named Medria Connolly and Brian Nichols who use that concept to try to make the case.
Yeah, and that's the context where we actually met.
That's right. That's right.
They gave a presentation this spring in the Seattle area.
Did you notice Medria talking about moral injury over and over?
I did.
Yeah.
Yes. So much so that I remembered one of the books that they referenced in those, and I actually bought it. We'll see how long it takes me to read it.
Which book was that?
It's actually one of the ones that you suggested here, I think. Implicated Subjects.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I remember she said that.
Yeah, which actually can make a nice transition to this next topic. You talked about the idea that the people who experience moral injury can be people who witness, people who participate, and also people who are hurt by the violation.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, Shay's combat veterans were mainly people who were suffering from what they had done, right? Atrocities and so forth.
Right.
But it didn't keep them from suffering moral injury because they still had consciences. And so you can be a perpetrator, what gets called a perpetrator, and be morally injured. And then, of course, the people who feel betrayed by the authorities are the victims, so to speak.
Right.
And I guess the thing that's not so obvious, but that is actually extremely important, is that a witness can suffer moral injury from what they witness. And one of the great examples for that is in Robert J. Lifton's book, Home from the War, where he was running a rap group for Vietnam veterans against the war and talking to a lot of veterans, not necessarily just those in the rap group. And he talks about this one man who was in the My Lai massacre in 68, right? And who didn't participate in shooting all the villagers. And people reported that this guy had gone around, he pointed his gun at the ground, and he was just saying, it's wrong, it's wrong. And Lifton talked to him later. And the man said, I mean, this gets into the complicatedness of what moral injury is. He felt like an as-if murderer because he had been there. It was his company that was doing this, and he didn't stop it. So he felt guilty that he didn't stop it. He felt ashamed that he was part of it in some way. And he couldn't get out of this complicated feeling. He kept repeating the scenario to himself and saying, well, what if I'd done this? No. What if I'd done that? No, wouldn't have worked, wouldn't have worked. So this man was actually a witness. If he experienced himself as a participant, for sure. And he was also a victim because his life story was that he had been kind of a messed up guy, a loner, and he found his way into the military, and he really identified with the military's ideals. So his ideals, in this case, were being betrayed by his military comrades, including the authorities who kind of led him into it and didn't stop it.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, oddly, maybe not so oddly, there was a period of time where I was working in a community mental health clinic with younger people mostly. And when you work in a place like that, you just get assigned people. They're just like, they work with you now. Go do therapy. And I was assigned this kid who was in detention waiting to be sentenced for gang-related violence. And when I would talk to him every week over the course of these months where he just waited, every time we met, we didn't know if he'd be sentenced before I saw him again. He started talking about the values of the gang he was a part of. His particular gang referred to it as knowledge, right? And they'd test one another on their knowledge. And it was kind of like these creeds, these statements of like justice and belief and honor. And over the course of us talking, maybe just because he was separated from that group of people, I don't know, he started talking about how the things that he saw the leadership in particular doing didn't match the knowledge, didn't match the values. And I remember when he was sentenced, there was a little bit of reporting on it. And one of the things that he did was very publicly and vocally denounce his gang affiliation. And it wasn't until this moment in this conversation that I was like, oh, that young man was working through the moral injury of the culture of violence that he'd been sort of suckered into a little bit. So, yeah, it's around.
Well, and he belonged to the gang. The fact that people are members of families, communities, groups, gangs, institutions, countries, it's a very strong bond. And when the betrayal of what's right comes from the group that you're part of, you get a lot of ambivalence because that's my family. Oh, they did this terrible thing. My sister's being abused, but it's my family. And so it makes it very hard to actually recover.
Right.
You keep sitting around and saying, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was all fine. Maybe they're right. Maybe something's wrong with me. And that's what the My Lai resistor, as we call him, did also. He said, well, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm a traitor. But this self-doubt and I call it obsessive preoccupation. So you keep going over it, trying to find a way to make it resolve for yourself. And it's very hard to do.
Yeah. Listeners will be aware of the outline. They know that I ask my my guests, our guides, to give an outline. So one of the things on the outline is actually something I think we're talking about, but I wanted to call it out specifically, which is about what makes moral injury particular and specific.
Good.
Because it's not just a feeling of outrage at injustice. It's not just a feeling of guilt or shame at having participated in something wrong. It sounds like this particular piece of this ambivalence and this conflict on a values level, that also sounds like it's also maybe my ego psychology is showing a little bit here, but it also sounds like it has something very important to do with identity, and particularly which groups you belong to.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean belong in almost a possessive sense. Like, I belong to this group and our values are this thing, but they did this other thing. How do I belong? Do I belong to the people? Do I belong to the values? How do I make sense of that tension?
Right. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, relevant here is the difference between PTSD and trauma as such and moral injury.
Yeah.
Because you talked about how the extremity of what happens sometimes to people in combat helped get us to this place where we're talking about moral injury. But
Right.
first, it got us to PTSD.
Right, right.
And so, in order to crystallize the concept of moral injury, Shea and others had to say, it's not just PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, because in PTSD, the main qualities are terror and helplessness. And it's like fear for your life. It's a
Right.
survival issue.
Mm-hmm.
And in just plain trauma, that's true. And you're totally overwhelmed. You're not able to function. Moral injury is not that. It's an awareness of conscience and conflicts around it through the betrayal, through the ambivalence, and so forth. And the conscience is not necessarily part of PTSD.
Right.
Right. Then you can have PTSD and moral injury at the same time, of course.
Yeah, I imagine that
different.
they could synchronize in some ways.
But that was a little bit of a tangent from identity, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it was really important to think about the betrayal part of the definition, betrayal of what's right.
Yeah.
Because betrayal is not just a bad thing that happens out there in the world. Betrayal feels like something that you were invested in, that you had a connection with,
Yeah.
that then turned against you.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels very personally wounding. And that's one of the things that makes it hard to get over. It's also one of the things that makes people who are morally injured turn to revenge. Because when you're morally injured, you feel helpless, like the guy. He couldn't stop the massacre.
Right.
He wished he could, but he couldn't. He tried, thinking what he could, and it didn't work. So that helplessness is like the psychoanalytic concept of impotent rage.
Right.
And the rage is there and the impotence. And what can you do with that? It's so frustrating. So in some cases, what will happen, it'll crystallize around, I want revenge on that person or institution or whatever that betrayed me.
Right.
And I think that's where these long-standing feuds and long-standing enemyships, even among nations like the French and the Germans, the Israelis and the Palestinians, where it gets so intractable because it's drawing on the unresolved and unresolvable moral injury, because revenge never resolved anything.
Right.
Just makes more injury that creates more revenge.
Right. So this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but we can jump around. Revenge doesn't resolve it. What can resolve moral injury?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, it's not clear to me that just like regular old trauma doesn't get all the way resolved.
Right. Right.
Bereavement doesn't get all the way resolved.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think moral injury gets all the way resolved.
Hmm.
Some things make a difference. If you're the injured person and it's another person that's betrayed you, and they make what I would call a full apology to you,
Mm-hmm.
which means they really get what they did to you and how much you suffered, and it really is their fault, and they take responsibility and say, I feel terrible. I know what I did. I feel terrible for your suffering, and I'm going to do anything I can to make it up.
Right.
That's like a full apology. Experiencing that can make a difference because the person, let's say it's a person who betrayed you, is not any longer just that malicious person who did the betrayal.
Right.
It's somebody who's become more of a person with a conscience.
Right.
And who wants to make a different relationship with you than the betrayal.
Yeah.
And that can make a difference. It won't necessarily, but it can.
Yeah.
So there's that. And there are versions of pieces of that, like the Truth and Reconciliation stuff in South Africa. That's a way that the people who are morally injured their suffering gets to be known by people that aren't going to try to make it worse.
Right.
Not necessarily the regular white people who kind of were complicit, but the commissioners who listened and maybe the audience.
Right.
So there's that. And reparations that Medria Connolly and Brian Nichols are talking about is part of the full apology where you try to make up as best you can.
Right.
To what's happened.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking this category, it started as being like in the context of massive, powerful, explicitly hierarchical systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Started in the context of the military, which is like, my undergrad was in sociology.
Yeah.
And like, if you want to research how a system's going to interact, if you can find your way to research something happening in a military context, there you go. The lines are clear. Whereas other contexts are a little more fuzzy, right? Mm-hmm. And you're talking about how this healing, reparative, restorative process that allows the betrayer to be more than just a betrayer. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah. I can see how that works in an individual or a dyad or some sort of like person-to-person level. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, oh boy, how do you do this in a societal context? And then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is an example. Reparations, which I think based off the presentation that we both were at, like that's a strong argument for the value of that. Mm-hmm. But this had me thinking about another thing on the outline, which is how powerful the role of denial is in moral injury and how that denial gets in the way of these kind of reparative processes.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the denial?
Yeah, I think the denial is extremely important because if you think about those combat veterans, those traumatized veterans that Shea worked in, the pain is so enormous.
Yeah.
That who wouldn't want to deny it if you could possibly?
Right.
So some people, you turn to drugs, to alcohol, you withdraw. So especially you try not to be reminded of it. I would say that one extreme form of denial is suicide because then you don't have to live with your own mind.
Right.
That is suffering like that. So denial is extremely tempting. Mm-hmm. And it's tempting both if you're the one who caused the moral injury and if you're the one who witnesses it. Look at how many of us have to say, I'm not reading the news anymore.
Right.
Because we identify with the people who are being so hurt, and it's horrible because we can't help them.
Yeah. I think I'm bringing a lot of the reparations presentation into how I'm thinking about this because I'm thinking so much about history here and the role of denial in like the fact that you and I are both white people who live in Seattle, right? Like there is moral injury to my values in the fact that I'm even here. Colonialism is inherently a moral injurious process.
Yeah.
Genocide is pretty inherently morally injurious.
Yeah.
But so thinking about this category of denial, I think about my dad. My dad had a really, really important relationship with his grandfather, my great-grandfather. Mm-hmm. And my great-grandfather's experience in World War II was really powerful and like had major impact on the family as a whole. He dealt with some trauma in coming back, and it like really informed his own like spirituality and how he interacted with the world and people. And when I was in college and learning all of my, leftist political theory, if I would talk to my dad about things even as like seemingly unanimously agreed upon as a bad idea, like Japanese internment, there was something in him that needed to deny how bad it was. He needed to say, well, at least they weren't concentration camps like the Nazis had. We weren't working people to death. They were just moved somewhere and then they got all their stuff back and they weren't mistreated. Like these are all things that he would say. And I make sense of that now in the context of this like denial of moral injury thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because for my dad, what the American government was doing during World War II was so closely tied to this man who was huge in his life.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And he didn't want to acknowledge
Yes.
the harm there,
Uh-huh.
the damage there, the evil there.
Yeah.
And Dad, if you're listening to this, as I've said on this podcast before, thank you for being my father and letting me use you as an example. Your thinking has evolved. But like for years, this was a real thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But if you think how for, let's say, roughly 100 years, that historians were presenting slavery as not so bad.
Yeah.
The Dunning tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's only been maybe, 40, 50 years gradually that all of this new history comes up and we just start to get a sense. So that one of the authors called this book, The Half Has Never Been Told.
Yeah. So if it feels like in broader social contexts and in the context of history and institutions, when there's incidences of moral injury that are not resolved in some way, they are forgotten by everyone who can forget.
That's a good way to say that, yes. And I would say they're not really forgotten. They're not totally forgotten.
Right.
Because if you're in denial about something, you're always kind of vigilant and defensive, because somewhere in you know that there's a different truth that could come out and stare you in the face.
Yeah. This is my own personal paranoid theory, but I feel like that's present in so many American, this is very silly, but American media, we talk about aliens in the way that other cultures don't. They come and invade and destroy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how we remember the moral injury of how we claimed the land we're on. We are imagining and afraid of some external force coming in and destroying us the way we destroyed and enslaved and relocated the people who lived here before we did.
Yes.
I feel like that's how our culture, one of the ways that our culture isn't forgetting, but is displacing, I suppose.
That's great. That's a great example. Yeah.
I like thinking about movies. One thing we haven't touched on, this category, moral injury, right? Moral itself, that's kind of a squishy word category. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question. I was thinking that, some people might be reluctant to publish my book because they might think, moral, what is she talking about? I don't know, use the right fork.
Right.
At dinner or something. Or,
etiquette.
Or morals.
Right. Yeah. The 10 Commandments or something.
Something, yeah. I mean, thou shalt not kill. That's okay.
Yeah.
I'll take that. So it's kind of basic, and it didn't come from the 10 Commandments either.
Right, yes.
Right. So I think conscience is helpful there because conscience, people can identify. They know what conscience is. And kids have consciences and are altruistic, and kids don't like seeing animals killed, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think people can identify with that. And then also, there's a philosopher who wrote a book about torture and rape as the quintessential moral injuries, which I haven't read yet, but I need to read. And he said, moral philosophy has basically two strains. One is a utilitarian. What's good is what's best for the most people.
Yeah.
And what's right is absolute. That's the deontological, it's called. Absolutely right. And that's like Kant, the golden rule. And he says, the way we know what's moral, what's right, is what we don't like it if it's done to ourselves. And if we see it done to somebody else, we don't want that done to ourselves. So it's when it's an injury, the injury part is what tips us off to what's moral. And it has to do with, I would say, two basic things. One is the Mildred Antonelli stuff, that a child growing up has legitimate expectations of adults. And betrayal of those expectations is wrong. It's not moral.
Yeah.
Morality is what legitimate care and concern for other people. especially the ones that you're responsible for.
Yeah.
That's one way of saying it that I think is pretty acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And the other way is saying a human being is worth something. And that goes in a much more universal direction of the human rights and the dignity and worth of the individual that should not be violated.
Yeah.
And you know that that's a moral thing when somebody has contempt for you and disrespects you because you're Jewish or gay or black or whatever. You know that that's wrong. So that's how I try to talk about the moral in the book, which is a complicated thing. I mean, honor has to do with the feeling of rightness and goodness of yourself and of your group that you're a part of. And it can coincide perfectly well with the honor of my group says you don't hurt kids.
Sure.
With the other things. You don't disrespect people. But it can also be much narrower than that. The honor of my group is if a woman commits adultery, we kill her.
Right.
That kind of stuff. And there's lots of that.
Right.
So that's more complicated.
Yeah. Groups of people develop honor codes.
Right.
And those honor codes are not universal. They're particular to each group of people.
Right.
And a moral injury can be the violation of something as basic as a child has a right to expect certain things from their caregivers, or it can be something as specific as my subculture has an honor code here that's been violated in a way that has caused harm. Well,
to the members of the group, we say, that's not right.
Right.
So like somebody steps on the flag, the American flag, and people say, that's not right. They have dishonored the flag. They don't say moral injury. They say dishonored, usually.
So dishonor and the category and concept of dishonor might be a way into thinking about moral injury. Like if
it might be, but it's also it might be a way into thinking of things that groups do that conflict with other definitions of what's moral.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, to go back to the example of that client that I had back in the day, the honor code that he was living under allowed for the behaviors that got him in prison. The honor code that he lived under allowed for the kind of violence that our broader society said, no, that's illegal, we're going to punish you for it. But the tension that he was talking to me about wasn't the tension between the honor code he had in his culture and the honor code of the broader society. It was between the honor code of his culture and the behaviors of the leaders within that culture. It sounds like that's where the moral injury space is where there's that conflict.
The part of the honor code that he believed in and fit with his conscience was violated by the leadership. Yeah, they were the ones that betrayed.
Yeah. It feels to me like this is an incredibly widespread phenomenon. Like, the more we're talking about this, the more examples are coming to my mind of situations that I've heard about or been a part of. You've been researching and studying and writing about this for a few years now. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. I mean, I connected it with the Vietnam War, with my experience of the Vietnam War, with my experience of they dropped those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with my experience of all sorts of bad stuff, bad, socially unjust stuff. But it's the hard thing about trying to think about moral injury in this way is this really means that all of us, like all of us Americans, all of us Americans who are not trying to shut down nuclear weapons, for instance, are kind of living in denial about that and what it's doing to people. And it's not total denial. We know this is not so great, but it's halfway denial at least.
Right.
You could say we're witnesses that are impotent witnesses in a way.
Right.
It's a question, how do you categorize the larger public who is not really doing anything about the things that are harming people?
Right. That's where I feel like that category of implicated subjects feels.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Now, when Rothberg talks about that, he's talking about not the kind of witnesses who really never found out or wanted to learn what was going on in the concentration camps. He's talking about enablers, basically. So there's all sorts of ways that people can, you're not necessarily putting the lead in the water, but you're helping make sure that nobody finds out or that nobody does anything about it.
Right.
So people that support financial campaigns, people in the media, those are the ones that come to mind right now.
Yeah. I feel like I still haven't seen this movie, in part because I don't have time to watch as many movies as I used to, and in part because it sounds really intense. But it feels like the movie that came out last year, I think it won an Oscar, Zone of Interest.
Oh, yeah.
It feels like it's kind of about the stuff that we're talking about here.
Right. Yeah. It's a big time denial.
Right.
Because here's the concentration camp, here's the wall, here's the nice family house.
Right. I feel like part of the reason that movie resonated, like it won an Oscar, is I think that's an experience that perhaps is because of how interconnected the world is now, that like anyone can post anything on the internet. And like there are gatekeepers who decide how difficult it is to see a thing. But like in the same way that the Vietnam War was, I've heard people argue that it was such a catalyst for the awareness of the moral injury inherent in war because it was televised. Because before then, war wasn't televised. And now war is live tweeted, right? Like we have immediate access to the subjectivities of the people involved. That like, I think in many ways, it's very easy for anybody to pay attention to the right space and feel like they're living next door to a concentration camp. Feel like evil is being perpetrated all around. And maybe I'm even benefiting from it. And like the question that comes to my mind is, how do I live? Right? Like, you know, cobalt is an important element for smartphones and how they work. And the vast majority of cobalt come from mines that we know are horrendous working environments and are employing vast numbers of children, many of whom die. And without a smartphone, it's kind of hard to get around in modern society. So there I am. I'm living next door to a concentration camp. The place where the child who is dying is at is in, you know, somewhere in a completely different hemisphere. But the effects of that, the benefit of that child's death, I'm reaping in some very distilled way. Or not distilled, diffused, I suppose. So like, there's the moral injury. How do we make sense of this? How do we keep participating in a generative way and not collapse?
Right. Yeah. Through denial.
Oh. Okay.
Right? I mean, that's it. You've given a good... Imagine if you tried to be conscious of all that all the time.
Right. Yeah, you would be paralyzed.
Yeah, you would be paralyzed. Right.
So are you saying that like the denial part of it, usually when people talk about denial, there's a tinge of moral judgment in it? Like denial's bad, you shouldn't deny stuff. Denying reality is considered a problem, even in the psychoanalytic literature. It sounds like part of what you might be saying here is actually a certain amount of denial is a necessary defense to like make coffee and get out of bed in the morning?
Certain amount, yeah. And then the question is, what about the other part? Or how do you...
Right.
A lot of people in this country are engaged in a massive process of counteracting denial, of coming out about certain things, of revealing things, of exposing things.
Sure.
All sorts of movements for greater awareness.
Right.
So it's not like there has to be 100% denial.
Right.
But one of the things that I don't talk about in my book very much at all is I talk about some of the, what I call the full apology and reparations and government apologies, et cetera, but I don't really talk about how people become something other than just morally injured. How do they become the people who say, okay, this was really horrible what happened to me, and I'm going to do something about it. I'm not going to just suffer my impotent frustration.
Yeah.
And I don't know what makes the difference. I'm sure that solidarity and communal recognition and support make a huge difference.
Right.
I know that.
Yeah. And that makes me think about my conversation with Carol Poole and some of, she was referencing Lifton and a lot of his ideas about communities, of like communities of survivors.
Yeah, right.
Or sort of like where that resilience comes from.
Yeah.
One of the things that seemed really valuable to me when I was first introduced to this category of moral injury, and then also of the like different implicated subjects concept, was that it takes these acts of like severe societal injustice and allows you a way to frame how it impacts people without needing there to be a monster and an innocent victim. Because very often it feels like when you're talking about things, something as small as like a violent assault or something as grand and vast as the North American slave trade, it's easy for us to reduce those things to, well, here's the bad guy and here's the innocent victim and this is the harm that was done to them.
Yeah.
And it feels like that framework can often feed back into that revenge idea, right? Or a punitive justice concept, or a sense that like, well, now you need to pay, which I think is part of the reason why so many of my relatives don't want to think even once about reparations, because it feels like they're being asked to pay for being descendant from a monster, basically, which doesn't feel fair to them. And like within that framework, yeah, it doesn't feel fair. So can you...
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, one of the things about the idea of moral injury is that the people we would consider the monsters are also the victims. I mean, and the Vietnam vets in that way are a very good example because people rightfully say, you know, these people came home from the war and they got spat on.
Right.
But actually, they had gone through something really horrendous. And they didn't need to be spit on.
Right.
That wasn't the right way to think about them.
Right.
So, and the people like the engineer who's making something that will help Amazon exploit people, he's not a monster.
No.
He's doing something that I would say is not good.
Right.
That he shouldn't be. He needs to find a different work.
He has already.
But he's also not happy with it.
No.
So the idea of sleeping peacefully at night, I mean, lots of people are not sleeping so well at night. Not because they're just monsters, but because they're entangled in this web of bad stuff. And they kind of know it, but they haven't figured out how not to be entangled in it.
Right. Yeah.
And the witnesses, I mean, think of what happens to us from being psychotherapists and witnessing what our patients are telling us. And we can help the patients, but we can't make the stuff not happen.
Right.
Not have happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember once when I did the environmental book, Colorado College asked me to come and give a lecture or whatever. So I was there and I was meeting with the students and they said, but what should I do? What should I do? I said, you should do the thing that you can do from your position, from who you are. Obviously, nobody can do everything. You can do one thing,
right?
Starting from where you are, which makes it much easier. So, like, what can I do? I am in a position where I've learned to write, so I can write this book, basically.
Yeah, that idea of like you do what you can do from the position that you have is incredibly empowering. And to accept how it's empowering, you also need to at least tolerate the limitations of your own power.
Right, yeah.
We don't want to do that.
Right.
I will speak for myself, perhaps. I don't want to do that.
No, yeah, you think your podcast will change everything.
Exactly. This is going to be listened to by every person in the world. Right. Barack Obama will be on season 2. It'll be great.
Right. I remember when the environmental book was about to come out, and I walked into the university bookstore and I thought, all these people have written books.
Right.
Millions of books.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Right.
Yeah.
There's something about limitation,
powerlessness.
Mhm.
So you made reference to impotent rage.
Yeah.
And I think within the context of psychoanalytic thought, it's important to contextualize that as like being in dialogue with the fantasy of omnipotence, which
Mhm.
for our listeners is assumed in psychoanalysis to be like a thing that everybody has. It's a developmentally normal thing to do as a child, which is to believe that you have the power to influence anything and everything. You make anything and everything happen.
And it's all your fault, too.
And it's all your fault too. Right. Here's an example of sort of like a playful way that played out. I had a nephew who was very excited because it was snowing, and his mom was sending a video to like the family of like, look out the window, it's snowing. What do you think of this, buddy? She said to him, you were talking about snow last night, and then it snowed the next day. And he said, I made it snow. Which is like, yeah, it feels like that. That's the omnipotent fantasy,
Yeah.
right? Which then becomes a problem if you learned about traffic safety at school and then the next day your grandpa gets in a car accident and breaks his foot. I made grandpa break his foot, right? That's part of the omnipotent fantasy.
Yeah.
And then impotent rage is one of the things that a person experiences when the omnipotent fantasy is undeniably shattered.
Yes. Yeah.
I was going somewhere with this. Do you remember where I was going?
No, I don't. But that's a really interesting point. This was a thought that just came to me pretty recently. The soldiers who, like this one soldier that Shay reports, he says, I was 18. I was innocent. It's not like I never did anything wrong, but I was innocent. I believed in goodness, etc. And look at me. I became evil. And I was thinking, he was 18. A lot of the people that went to Vietnam were very young. They were drafted. They were young. Now they may be volunteers, but they have pressures that make them volunteer. Is what's going on. And I think to some extent this is. We get morally injured when we are naive. And we still have that omnipotent fantasy. So then we feel impotent rage.
Right.
Because who would expect, who was sophisticated and knowledgeable, who would be surprised that the people go to Vietnam and everything is unfamiliar and scary, and who would be surprised that they shoot up people?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Who would be surprised that a corporation that's there to make money and that has all these powerful, power-hungry people wanting their profit, who would be surprised if they cover up things that are damaging?
Right.
Of course they do.
Right.
So the whistleblowers are, in some sense, not willing to accept the horrors, the ordinary horrors of the world. Now that's a weird, there's some substance to that thought, even if it's a kind of discomforting.
Absolutely. And part of what I'm thinking about is like that this moral injury and how it relates to omnipotence, and that like when I think debating to even talk about this. Sure, I'll talk about this. When I was very young, my parents were a part of a cult, and one of the leaders of the cult murdered his wife. Yeah. This was one of our regular preachers, right? This is someone who was literally instructing in morality.
Yeah.
And then he murdered his wife. So like, listener, that's some context I'm bringing to this discussion of moral injury, right? I was a part of this community when I was 8 years old. All this happened. At 8 years old, my omnipotent fantasies were still very present. And my parents and other members of that church, I think, were investing their omnipotent fantasy in the leadership of the church. Some people will argue everyone does that. Any religious person will do that with God on some level, right? That like you take your fantasy of omnipotence and put it in the church. As a participant in the church, the belief is the leadership will be moral because that's what they're supposed to do.
Right.
They're not supposed to be self-interested. They're not supposed to have the capacity for that kind of selfish violence. But they did.
Yeah.
And that everyone involved, like the woman who was killed, I don't think she imagined that her husband could have done to her what he did.
Yeah.
And if she did imagine that, she was able to be in denial about it.
Yeah.
At least long enough to be killed.
Yeah.
And kind of going back to Aunt Nellie, her idea, like everyone involved in that had good reason to expect that the leadership of the church would treat all the people in the church in a particular way.
Yes.
I'm not trying to suggest that this woman who was killed was somehow responsible. What I'm suggesting is that the moral injury of this specific murder violated everyone's omnipotent fantasy, violated everyone's sense that goodness would prevail.
Yes.
And that there are certain things that good people are incapable of doing. And that there are certain stations in life that grant you the category good person.
Right. So what happened to the congregation? I mean, did people try to make excuses? Did they say, oh, she was actually bad. It's good that he did this, or we have to understand? Or did it destroy the group? Or what happened?
It was kept secret. There were other conflicts within the church, so that it ended up kind of splitting, fracturing shortly after the events of the murder for what some would say were unrelated causes, believing in a social unconscious. I don't know. I think that the murder was involved.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was about 2 years later that everything came to light.
Yeah.
And at that point,
You mean people didn't know that?
yeah, nobody knew. He hid it successfully for about 2 years.
Wow.
And people really wrestled with how to make sense of it.
Yes.
I'm still wrestling with how to make sense of it. And one of the things that surprises me is how few of them have left Christianity. It's genuinely surprising. I would assume that if there was this much betrayal and violation, some of it would be attached to the value system itself. Kind of like my client, right? He rejected the entire value system of the gang.
Yeah.
But
interesting. But that's not the normal thing.
Yeah.
Like there's a 19th century, the Silas Marner.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, but
so-
our listeners haven't read the chapter, so you can summarize it for them.
Yeah. So this is a novel by George Eliot from 1861, and it's about this young, naive, very religiously faithful man, Silas Marner, who was part of a little sect, and he has a best friend who's also part of the same sect, and he has I didn't mention this before, he has a fiancée also. And the three of them can hang around a lot and are thought of as the golden boys of this sect. So an elder of the sect is dying, and Silas is watching at his bedside at night. And in the morning, it turns out that there was some money in the room and it's gone. And what happens is that Silas says, I don't know anything about this. I'm innocent, which he was. And his friend betrays him by saying, oh, that's Satan talking through you. And then the church, the next level up, says, well, how do we decide this? And, we're going to draw lots.
Right.
Flip a coin or whatever. And it says Silas is guilty. And you have to leave the church. And so he's lost his friend. His friend marries his fiancée, by the way. And he's lost his church. And as he's going, he says, basically, I condemn your God who doesn't protect the innocent. So he loses his faith.
Yeah.
Then, which is kind of what you would have expected.
Yeah. Or I think about the Brothers Karamazov, right? The Grand Inquisitor chapter, right?
Which I haven't read.
Well, it's this, right? It's one of the three brothers is educated in the city, and he's talking to his brother who's currently spending his time as a monk, which was culturally normal for men of a certain age. And he essentially makes this argument. He says, if one little child suffers, then I can't believe in God. That's his statement. What am I trying to get at here? Moral injury seems like such a powerful experience that could threaten people's morals themselves, their value systems themselves.
Right. Yeah.
But so often, people find ways to maintain their value system.
Well, their belonging. See, that's why I would say that's the ambivalence.
I see.
That Christianity was part of something they were part of, and they didn't want to stop being part of it.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we might think that our values are more important than our belonging to a group.
Or we might not distinguish them.
Religion is a space that I think about a lot. So I can imagine that a lot of Catholics have gone through this in the past, 30 years since the big sex abuse scandal really broke open. And I imagine that a lot of Americans are going through it still after the racial reckoning of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
There's a part of me that's still waiting for that to happen with Indigenous people. Like, we're just starting to do that culturally at another level. It almost feels like it comes in waves. Every generation or so, a generation being like 40-ish years, there's another wave of like getting deeper and like trying to reckon with this history.
Yeah.
It's really disorienting. It leaves one cast adrift a little bit.
Yeah, that's why you cling to the belonging.
Right.
I was thinking about this doesn't apply to the Indigenous people, but it applies to race, about the American ideals/ideology of freedom, justice, equality, that you can be an oppressed group, but so holding on to those ideals that you can criticize the oppression using the ideals, but you can also hold on to the ideals as a way of denying the oppression. Either way.
Right. This gets into really complicated space very quickly.
Yeah.
But space that I feel like part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation is because I feel like the stuff that we're talking about both gets complicated very quickly and also is such a common human experience. Like, I hope that somebody listening to this will get something useful out of it and that they might evolve some of their own thinking around it to be able to try. There's this idea that, like, if you don't have a pause, you don't make a choice. If you don't pause and think about something, then you're not actually choosing. You're just running off of whatever previous patterns or habits you have. So I'm kind of hoping that this conversation can act as that pause for some people of like, okay, here's a different way of thinking about some of the stuff you've been involved in, things that has happened to you, things you've done, things you've observed, things you've helped support and hold up. And hopefully this is a way to think about it that gives people a little bit of flexibility, a way to move out of rigid categories of victim, perpetrator, or whatever else.
And also a way to say, I've been batting this back and forth in my mind and not able, and maybe this is why, because this was an instance of moral injury. And part of that is, boy, it's hard to resolve.
Right. Yeah.
So the naming of it may be useful also.
Right. Rigidity is often how people find their way out of the tension of ambivalence.
Yeah.
So maybe, listener, if you have an ambivalence about something, like maybe if it has a name of moral injury, it might be easier to find a way to keep working through it as opposed to getting lost and a little dissociated or falling back on rigidity that doesn't allow for growth.
Yeah.
I've used enough of your time. Thank you. Before we wrap up, is there anything that we didn't get to that you want to make sure to speak on?
You had asked what I would recommend people to read.
Yes. Further learning.
Yes. And so the main book where people actually talk about moral injury is Shea's book. And it's called Achilles in Vietnam, Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. The main person who influenced my thinking in general is Robert J. Lifton, who wrote about what happens to people psychologically in very extreme situations, like cults, survivors of Hiroshima, the doctors who worked for the Nazis in the concentration camp, the people who had been brainwashed in China in the 50s.
Right.
And so forth. And it's very instructive about the kinds of pressures that are put on people psychologically and what they do with them. So I would recommend anything that Lifton wrote.
Yeah. And he's written a lot.
He's written a lot. Yeah.
And listener, there will be links to the books that we've just talked about, also some of the other books that we mentioned available in the show notes.
Okay.
And if you don't know how to find the show notes, if you're listening on a phone, probably open the app you're listening on and swipe left. Most likely, that's where your show notes are. So you can find the links to stuff there. Finally, do you want to talk about your book? This podcast episode will be coming out likely a year or more before it comes out. But do you want to talk about it?
I mean, I've kind of been talking about it.
That's true.
Right. I'm not sure what it'll be called. It might just be called On Moral Injury.
Okay.
And it will cover these themes about betrayal, about denial, about conflicts and ambivalence. And then it also has chapters on killing and combat, which is kind of the most fundamental place we see this, and a chapter on the nuclear enterprise, both the atomic scientists who made the bomb and afterwards said, oh, but we meant so well.
Right.
We were really trying to do something good.
Yeah.
And then the ongoing arms race. And then a chapter about racism as a malignant normality, where the norms are that something bad goes on.
Yeah.
And the moral injury that does both to Black people and to white people.
Right. Right.
And then it has part about some of the kinds of efforts that you can make to repair moral injury, like the Truth and Reconciliation kind of hearings, the full apology, reparations, and so forth.
Yeah. I'm very excited for this book to come out, so I'll have to be patient. And then if people are listening to this episode and are interested in finding you, where would you like to be found?
Well, I should say that I only very rarely take on a new patient. So, but the Northwest Alliance for Psychoanalytic Study, I'm listed there.
That's the way to find you. Do you take on supervisees or anything like that?
No, I mainly want people to read.
Yep. Shierry, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you,
really
guys.
appreciate
It was
it.
really good talking with you.
Special thanks to Shierry Weber Nicholsen. Links to some books and articles that Shierry recommended are available in the show notes. Shierry's book is not released yet, but keep an eye on this space, listener, because as soon as it is, you'll hear about it from me. We'll be back in 2 weeks, where I'll have a discussion with Brian Pendergast on the topic of re-examining narcissism. This has been The Way In. This show is hosted and produced by me, Tyson Connor, with music by Ben Lewis and visual art by Dan Lane. If you enjoyed this show, please rate, review, subscribe, follow, like, share, star, heart, reblog, retweet, repost, upvote, or in some meaningful way engage with the episode on your digital platform of choice. I'm told it makes a big difference for exposing more people to the show. And if you think someone you know may like this episode, you could also just tell them about it. You can follow the show on social media, where we are at The Way In Pod. There you can give me feedback, tell me a joke, and see high-resolution versions of the individual episode art, which I highly recommend. I think Dan did a great job. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.
I work with a lot of teenagers, and whenever you talk to a teenager about a complex social issue, it doesn't matter where they are on the political spectrum, eventually they will suggest murdering an entire class of person. It just comes to mind. Teenagers.
Oh, teenagers.
If you're talking to teenagers, it's just developmentally, it's in the human mind to do this sort of thing. Most of them move on from that pretty quickly, but not everyone does. So, genocide, very complicated. Anyway, edit point.
Nuke 'em.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh.